The freezing hardwood floor of our Chicago penthouse was slick with melting snow. Two massive guards stepped back as my husband tossed a crisp piece of paper at my bruised body. $24 million. A payout for the physical trauma his men just inflicted to protect his weeping mistress. He demanded I take it and vanish. He had no idea that by tomorrow his luxury resort empire would face obliteration. The freelance designer he discarded was actually the sole heiress to a $500 billion real estate dynasty. I am Mary. Before I continue, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. The sheer physical force used to restrain me left my chest aching with a dull, heavy throb. Every breath I took felt constrained, a sharp reminder of the power dynamic Dylan had just violently established in our own foyer. I remained perfectly still on the imported stone tile, refusing to give them the satisfaction of my tears. Above me, the sprawling, floor-to-ceiling windows showcased a brutal Chicago blizzard, the howling wind completely muffled by the expensive soundproof glass. Inside, however, the real storm was standing right in front of me. Dylan adjusted his custom-tailored suit cuffs with a chilling, practiced precision. He looked down at me not with the eyes of a husband, but with the utter disdain of an executive looking at a bad investment. Standing half-hidden behind his broad shoulders was Sadie. She was 23, a junior interior designer Dylan had recently hired for his flagship resort project. Right now, she was clinging to his jacket sleeve, pressing a silk handkerchief against a microscopic, entirely fabricated red mark on her cheek. She let out a series of pathetic, trembling sobs that echoed off the high vaulted ceilings of the penthouse. Her performance was painfully amateurish, yet Dylan swallowed every single drop of it. Sadie whimpered that I had completely lost my mind, claiming I had attacked her out of baseless jealousy the moment I walked through the door. The truth was far less theatrical. I had simply returned home from a site inspection 3 hours early, only to find them tangled together on the expensive Italian leather sofa I had purchased. When I calmly demanded an explanation, Sadie had panicked, deliberately scratching her own face with her acrylic nail before screaming for the private security detail. Dylan had instantly ordered his men to subdue me. That order quickly escalated into a ruthless physical lesson on who truly owned this household. Now Dylan reached into his inner pocket and pulled out his leather-bound checkbook. He looked at me with absolute disgust, lecturing me about my profound ingratitude. He reminded me, in a voice dripping with condescension, that he had pulled me out of obscurity. He claimed he had given a struggling freelance landscape designer a life of unparalleled luxury, a world I could never have accessed on my own. And this, he sneered, was how I repaid his boundless generosity. He tore the check from the booklet and let it flutter down to the cold floor beside me. $24 million. He stated the amount with a flat, businesslike tone, calling it a generous severance package for my immediate departure. He demanded I sign the divorce papers his legal team would send by morning and strictly warned me to never show my face in his city again. I did not scream. I did not defend myself against Sadie's absurd lies. I simply stared at the piece of paper, memorizing the exact ink strokes of his arrogant signature. It was exactly 11:45 in the evening. The illusion was entirely shattered. Before the heavy silence in the room could fully settle, the quiet click of footsteps approached from the hallway leading to the servant quarters. Mrs. Higgins, our 68-year-old head housekeeper, hurried into the foyer. She was wearing her modest gray uniform, her face pale with shock as she took in the horrific scene. For 3 years, she had been the unseen heartbeat of this massive, cold penthouse. While Dylan spent his evenings at high-profile networking galas and charity dinners, it was Mrs. Higgins who made sure I ate, who brought me warm tea when I worked late on blueprints, and who treated me like a human being rather than a corporate accessory. Seeing me sitting on the cold floor, visibly battered and surrounded by hostile guards, something inside the elderly woman snapped. Ignoring the sheer physical danger, she pushed past the massive security contractors and dropped to her knees beside me. Her frail, wrinkled hands gently touched my shoulder, trying to shield me from Dylan's terrifying glare. She looked up at the man who paid her salary, her voice shaking but laced with genuine, undeniable outrage. She asked him how he could possibly treat his own wife like a common criminal, begging him to stop this madness and show a shred of decency. Dylan's reaction was not an ounce of remorse or hesitation. It was pure, unadulterated venom, his handsome face contorted into a mask of absolute fury. How dare a replaceable employee question his authority in his own home? He took a threatening step forward, his shadow falling over both of us. He did not physically strike her, but the words he used were designed to completely dismantle her life. With a voice as cold as the blizzard outside, Dylan fired her on the spot. But simply terminating her employment was not enough to satisfy his bruised ego. He looked down at the elderly woman who had maintained his pristine life for over a decade and delivered a calculated, devastating blow. He coldly informed her that she had just forfeited her entire retirement package. Because she had breached her non-disclosure and loyalty agreements by interfering with his private security protocols, he was going to instruct his corporate accounting department to seize every single dollar of her accumulated pension. Mrs. Higgins gasped, her hands trembling as the reality of his threat sank in. She was a widow with no other family, entirely dependent on that pension to survive her remaining years. Dylan smirked, clearly enjoying the sheer terror washing over her face. He told her to pack her bags and get out of his building tonight, tossing a cruel remark about how she could go share a cardboard box with his ex-wife. Sitting there feeling the cold marble beneath me, a profound shift occurred in my mind. The betrayal of his affair was painful, and the physical force his men used was traumatic. But watching him effortlessly destroy an innocent, defenseless, elderly woman just to flex his power was the ultimate catalyst. He had crossed a line from which there was absolutely no return. I looked up at Dylan, my expression utterly blank, but my mind was already actively calculating his total ruin. He had chosen his fate. The heavy mahogany doors of the penthouse slammed shut behind us, the sound echoing through the sterile, mirrored walls of the private elevator lobby. I stood up slowly, managing the dull ache radiating through my ribs, and wrapped my arm around Mrs. Higgins. The elderly woman was weeping softly, the devastating weight of losing her entire livelihood crashing down upon her fragile shoulders. I held her close, letting her lean on me as the steel doors of the elevator glided open. The descent down 70 floors was suffocatingly quiet. I did not offer her empty platitudes or false promises that everything would magically be okay. I simply held her hand, my own grip, firm and unnervingly steady. When we reached the grand lobby, the scene was entirely predictable. The night concierge, a man who had greeted me with warm, polite smiles every single morning for 3 years, quickly averted his eyes and pretended to be engrossed in a ledger. Dylan had clearly already called down officially, flagging both of us as permanent security risks. We were no longer welcome residents. We were immediate trespassers. I did not waste a single second attempting to reason with the building staff. I guided Mrs. Higgins through the heavy, revolving glass doors and stepped directly into the brutal reality of the Chicago winter. The wind howled through the concrete canyons of the city, driving sharp, icy snow into our faces. The temperature was well below freezing, and neither of us had been given the opportunity to grab a proper winter coat. I flagged down a passing yellow taxi, the headlights cutting through the blinding white storm. I opened the rear door and gently helped Mrs. Higgins slide into the heated interior, reaching into the pocket of my thin cardigan. I pulled out a stack of emergency cash I always kept on hand. I pressed it into her trembling fingers, instructing her to go to a warm hotel downtown and wait for my call. I promised her, looking directly into her tear-filled eyes, that her pension would be restored tenfold by the end of the week. She begged me to come with her, terrified of what I might do alone in the storm. I offered her a soft, reassuring smile, closing the taxi door and tapping the roof twice to signal the driver. I watched the red taillights of the cab disappear into the thick veil of falling snow, ensuring she was completely safe. Now, I was entirely alone on the freezing pavement. The biting cold whipped against my skin, but I hardly registered the dropping temperature. My mind was operating with a hyper-focused, lethal clarity. I reached deep into the hidden lining of my sweater. My fingers bypassed the crumpled $24 million check and closed around a small, encrypted biometric drive. It was a flawless piece of custom hardware, completely untraceable, granting direct, unfiltered access to the irrevocable trust my late grandfather had established explicitly for me. Dylan thought he had just discarded a helpless nobody into the gutter. He was completely wrong. The clock struck 1 exactly. As the relentless wind whipped the snow around me, my mind involuntarily drifted away from the freezing street, pulled back to the exact moment I allowed myself to walk into Dylan's meticulously constructed trap. It was 3 years ago during a high-profile philanthropic gala hosted at a historic museum. I was attending under strict anonymity, wearing a modest off-the-rack dress, quietly observing the elite circles my family routinely funded. I desperately wanted a break from the suffocating pressure of being the sole heir to the Thorn global real estate empire. I wanted to exist simply as Mary, a woman with a passion for landscape architecture unburdened by the weight of a $500 billion legacy. Dylan had spotted me standing near a floral display I had personally designed. At the time, his resort development company was just a mid-sized operation, aggressively seeking venture capital. He approached me with a charming, practiced smile, holding a glass of cheap champagne. He assumed, based on my unbranded clothing and quiet demeanor, that I was just a hired contractor lucky to be in the same room as the city's elite. He immediately launched into a grandiose monologue about his vision, his upcoming projects, and his unparalleled genius. He did not ask about my life. He only wanted an audience for his own greatness. And strangely, I let him speak. I found his transparent arrogance almost refreshing compared to the calculated, multi-layered manipulations of the billionaires I usually dealt with. Dylan played the role of the benevolent savior perfectly. He invited me to dinner at an overpriced restaurant, making sure to loudly announce to the waiter that he was covering the bill. He loved the feeling of being the provider, the absolute center of gravity in our dynamic. He needed to be the smartest, wealthiest, and most important person in the room, and my quiet, unassuming presence gave him the perfect backdrop to shine against. When we eventually married, the dynamic only intensified. He paraded me around as his humble, supportive wife, the grounded woman who kept the visionary CEO tethered to reality. Meanwhile, I spent my days quietly sketching the intricate ecological blueprints that ultimately secured his biggest resort contracts. He took full credit for the designs, presenting them to his board of directors as his own brilliant conceptual breakthroughs. He thought I was too naive to understand the business, too submissive to ever demand recognition. He genuinely believed his expanding wealth gave him the divine right to treat people as disposable assets. He looked down on anyone who could not elevate his public status. He thought he had rescued me from a life of mediocrity, completely unaware that the only reason his company had survived its latest funding round was because I had secretly directed Thorn Global's subsidiary branches to approve his critical bridge loans. I had built the very stage he was currently using to destroy me. His ego was his religion. Standing in the snow, gripping the biometric drive in my freezing pocket, I confronted the harsh, uncomfortable truth of my own complicity. Why did I stay? Why would a woman possessing enough generational wealth to buy and dismantle Dylan's entire industry 10 times over endure 3 years of emotional neglect and psychological belittlement? To the outside world, my submission would look like sheer stupidity. But the reality was a deeply complex psychological cage I had willingly locked myself inside. In the high-stakes, cutthroat world of my family's empire, trust was an absolute myth. From the moment I could walk, I was taught to analyze every relationship for hidden agendas, corporate espionage, and financial exploitation. My grandfather, the ruthless architect of Thorn Global, raised me to view people not as companions, but as liabilities. That level of constant, suffocating paranoia was a heavy, exhausting armor to wear. When Dylan entered my life, his blatant narcissism actually felt like a bizarre form of safety. I knew exactly who he was and exactly what he wanted. His flaws were entirely on the surface. There was no complex hidden agenda, just a predictable, massive ego. I fell victim to the invisible chain of learned helplessness. I craved the illusion of a normal, quiet family life so desperately that I actively blinded myself to the toxic reality of our marriage. I convinced myself that his condescension was just the stress of running a startup. I rationalized his late nights and unexplained absences as necessary sacrifices for his ambition. By shrinking myself down, by playing the role of the meek, dependent freelance designer, I protected the fantasy. I accepted the small daily indignities because fighting back would require me to unleash the terrifying power I possessed, effectively shattering the fragile, ordinary life I had tried so hard to build. I had convinced myself that maintaining the peace was worth the erosion of my own dignity. I allowed him to take credit for my architectural designs because his happiness validated my sacrifice. I wore the invisible chain willingly believing that if I just loved him enough, if I was just supportive enough, he would eventually see me as an equal partner rather than a convenient prop. But tonight, looking at the bruised tissue on my ribs and remembering the terror in Mrs. Higgins' eyes, The psychological fog completely evaporated. Dylan had not just broken his marital vows, he had violently shattered the very foundation of the fantasy I was protecting. The invisible chain did not snap because of the pain he inflicted on me. It snapped because I realized my silence had empowered a monster who preyed on the defenseless. I no longer wanted a normal life. I wanted absolute, unmitigated justice. The heiress was finally awake. The piercing wind of the Chicago blizzard offered a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat of the memories flooding my mind. As I walked down the empty pavement, my thoughts remained anchored to the frail woman sitting in the back of that yellow taxi. Mrs. Higgins was never just a housekeeper to me. In the sprawling, perfectly curated emptiness of Dylan's penthouse, she was the only genuine source of warmth. I remembered a particularly brutal winter 2 years ago. I had contracted a severe strain of pneumonia, my fever spiking dangerously high. Dylan had simply packed a tailored overnight bag, citing a critical networking gala in Aspen. He told me to drink plenty of water and walked out the door without a second glance, leaving me shivering alone in the dark. It was Mrs. Higgins who stayed. She ignored her scheduled days off, refusing to leave my bedside. She placed cool, damp cloths on my burning forehead and brewed traditional herbal remedies, murmuring soft, comforting stories about her own childhood to keep me grounded through the fever dreams. She did not do it for overtime pay or corporate favor. She did it because she possessed a fundamental human decency that Dylan entirely lacked. Growing up in the notoriously cutthroat environment of the Thorne dynasty, I was surrounded by brilliant tacticians, ruthless negotiators, and people who only viewed relationships as transactional assets. Genuine, unprompted kindness was a completely foreign concept to me. Mrs. Higgins had effortlessly stepped into the void, becoming the quiet, steady mother figure I so desperately needed in that isolating ivory tower. Dylan knew exactly how much she meant to me. His decision to violently expel her into the freezing storm, stripping away her hard-earned pension, was not a random act of anger. It was a highly calculated strike designed to isolate and punish me. He believed that by destroying her, he was proving his absolute dominance over my world. He thought he was teaching me a lesson about the brutal realities of power, demonstrating that anyone who sided with me would face total ruin. Instead, he had made a catastrophic miscalculation. By harming the one person who had shown me unconditional love, he had completely severed the invisible psychological chain that kept my true identity dormant. He had crossed the sacred line from a personal marital dispute into an unforgivable moral transgression. The cold air filled my lungs, but the fire igniting in my chest was absolute. I was going to dismantle his entire existence piece by piece, and I would do it all in her name. She was my real family. My silent endurance over the past 3 years was not merely emotional, it was entirely professional. Dylan's rapid ascent in the luxury real estate sector was widely attributed to his supposedly brilliant visionary concepts for eco-friendly resorts. The Architectural Digest magazines called him a pioneer of sustainable luxury, a genius who perfectly blended modern aesthetics with environmental preservation. The truth was buried in the unlocked bottom drawer of my drafting desk. Dylan possessed incredible charisma and an undeniable talent for manipulating venture capitalists, but he lacked a single creative bone in his body. The intricate, award-winning blueprints that secured his massive funding rounds were exclusively mine. I remembered the countless nights I spent hunched over my drafting table, meticulously calculating the integration of natural topography with high-end structural engineering. I sketched the foundational designs for the flagship Colorado resort, successfully solving a complex geothermal heating issue that his entire highly paid engineering team had deemed completely impossible. When I proudly showed him the solution, he had kissed my forehead, calling us the perfect team. Yet, the very next morning, I watched a live stream of his board meeting. He stood before a room of wealthy investors, confidently presenting my exact blueprints. He did not mention my name. He did not call it a collaborative effort. He claimed the late-night epiphany was entirely his own. When I confronted him later that evening, he deployed his weaponized charm flawlessly. He insisted that the investors needed a singular, strong leader to believe in. He argued that since we were married, his success was inherently my success. He promised that once the company went public, he would officially name me as the lead design director. I swallowed the lie because I wanted to believe in the partnership. I allowed him to build his towering empire on the quiet, uncredited labor of my mind. I handed him the very sword he just used to cut me down. Now, as I navigated the icy streets, the $24 million check resting in my pocket felt like the ultimate insult. He was attempting to buy my silence using the very wealth my intellect had generated. He genuinely believed I was a naive freelancer who would be dazzled by a string of zeros. He had no idea that I understood the structural integrity of his company better than he did. I knew exactly which financial load-bearing walls to knock out to bring the entire resort empire crashing down around his ears. He had stolen my architectural legacy to build his throne. Now I was going to forcefully repossess the foundation. He built his empire on me. Before I completely crossed the threshold into the ruthless world of my family's power, a small, lingering fragment of my humanity demanded a final test. I stopped beneath the flickering glow of a broken street lamp shielding my smartphone from the driving snow. My fingers, numb from the biting cold, scrolled through my contacts until I found Monica. She was Dylan's older sister and the executive director of legal affairs for his company. Throughout our marriage, Monica had always treated me with a thinly veiled, polite condescension. She tolerated my presence simply because I made her volatile brother manageable. I pressed the call button, listening to the monotonous ringtone echo against the howling wind. I needed to know if the rot in Dylan's soul was an isolated anomaly or a systemic disease running through his entire family tree. Monica answered on the fourth ring, her voice crisp, awake, and entirely devoid of warmth. She did not ask if I was safe. She did not ask why I was calling at 1 a.m. during a severe blizzard. She simply stated with chilling corporate efficiency that she was already drafting the non-disclosure agreements. She coldly advised me to take the $24 million and disappear without causing a public relations nuisance. I kept my voice perfectly level, suppressing the sharp pain radiating from my fractured ribs. I informed her that Dylan's men had used excessive physical force. I told her that I was standing on the street injured, and that he had unlawfully terminated an elderly woman's pension out of pure spite. I offered Monica one singular opportunity to act with basic human decency, to intervene and correct her brother's catastrophic behavior before the situation escalated beyond repair. Monica let out a sharp, mocking laugh that cut right through the static of the connection. She called me a pathetic, gold-digging manipulator. She confidently asserted that I had no medical proof, no legal standing, and absolutely no resources to challenge a billionaire executive. She explicitly threatened that if I attempted to contact the police or the press, her legal team would freeze my meager community bank accounts and bury me in so much litigation I would be begging for change on the subway. She ordered me to sign the papers by morning or face absolute destruction. The final test was complete. The disease was indeed systemic. Monica believed her corporate title and her brother's newly acquired wealth made them completely untouchable. She was blissfully unaware that she was threatening a woman who could buy her entire law firm with a single phone call. I did not argue. I did not plead. I simply ended the call, slipping the frozen device back into my pocket. The last remnants of my naive, forgiving nature froze solid in the Chicago winter. Mercy was no longer an option. I turned my back on the street lamp and walked 2 precise blocks east, moving away from the luxury residential district and stepping into a quiet, heavily industrialized zone of the city. My destination was a nondescript, brutalist brick building that appeared to be an abandoned warehouse. There were no signs, no illuminated windows, and absolutely no indications of life. I approached the heavy steel loading door, brushing a thick layer of snow away from a seemingly rusted electrical panel. I pressed my right thumb against a hidden biometric scanner embedded in the metal. A microscopic green laser swept across my pupil. A second later, the heavy steel door unlocked with a quiet pneumatic hiss. I stepped inside, leaving the roaring blizzard behind. The interior was a pristine, brightly lit elevator cabin paneled in brushed titanium. The doors sealed shut, and the cabin immediately began a rapid stomach-dropping descent deep beneath the Chicago streets. This was a classified high-security extraction bunker entirely funded and operated by Thorn Global Real Estate. It was designed exclusively for the protection and crisis management of our highest-ranking family members. When the doors finally slid open, the stark contrast to the freezing street was absolute. A team of elite private medical personnel was already waiting in the sterile subterranean medical bay. The automated perimeter sensors had instantly alerted the network the moment my biometrics were registered. A seasoned trauma physician doctor. Vance stepped forward, his professional demeanor, masking his visible alarm at my pale face and the unnatural way I was holding my right side. He immediately guided me toward a state-of-the-art examination table beneath blinding surgical lights. The next 30 minutes were a blur of sharp pain and cold clinical efficiency. They carefully cut away my damp sweater to reveal the massive dark purple contusions spreading aggressively across my ribcage. The high-resolution imaging scans confirmed the brutal reality of Dylan's orders. 3 ribs were cleanly fractured, the jagged bone resting dangerously close to my lung. Doctor, Vance immediately prepared a syringe of highly concentrated military-grade narcotics. I raised my uninjured left hand, gripping his wrist to stop him. I firmly ordered him to administer only localized nerve blocks and basic anti-inflammatories. I needed my mind entirely sharp, completely unclouded by heavy sedatives. Doctor, Vance frowned but nodded, respecting the absolute authority in my tone. The physical agony radiating through my chest was excruciating, but it served a vital purpose. The pain kept me entirely awake. With the localized nerve blocks finally taking effect, the paralyzing fire in my chest settled into a manageable, dull ache. I stepped down from the examination table, ignoring Dr. Vance's strict recommendation for immediate bed rest. I walked past the medical bay and entered the primary command center of the bunker. The room was expansive, lined with massive high-definition digital monitors displaying global market algorithms, satellite feeds, and the internal financial nervous system of the Thorn Empire. The low, steady hum of the massive encrypted servers felt like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant waiting for my command. A silent logistics operative handed me a sealed garment bag. I stepped into a private adjoining suite and systematically stripped away the ruined, blood-stained clothes of the woman Dylan thought he had conquered. The cheap, sensible fabrics I had worn for 3 years to maintain my unassuming disguise were unceremoniously dropped into an incinerator chute. I showered quickly, the hot water washing away the physical traces of the penthouse floor. I dried off and opened the garment bag, pulling out a custom-tailored, razor-sharp charcoal suit. It was cut from flawless Italian wool, fitting me like a perfectly engineered suit of armor. I secured a heavy platinum luxury watch around my wrist. Staring into the mirror, the submissive freelance designer was entirely gone. I walked back into the command center, projecting an aura of absolute, unyielding authority. I approached the central mahogany console and placed my palm flat against the glowing authorization pad. The massive screens flared to a brilliant, undeniable green, signaling the formal activation of the chief executive protocol. It was exactly 4:15 in the morning. I instructed the communications operative to establish a secure, priority uplink to our senior financial directors in Geneva and New York. Within seconds, the faces of 5 highly disciplined wealth managers appeared on the monitors. They were impeccably dressed, despite the brutal hour, their expressions reflecting absolute readiness. They did not ask about my sudden reappearance or my 3-year absence from the executive boardroom. In the Thorn dynasty, questions were reserved for the weak. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the console. I instructed them to initiate a full-scale, aggressive forensic audit of a specific mid-sized luxury resort developer based in Chicago. I provided Dylan's name and the exact corporate registration numbers of his holding companies. I commanded them to map every single dollar, every hidden asset, and every leveraged debt attached to his existence. The hunt officially began. Asher, the lead forensic accountant for Thorn Global's aggressive acquisitions division, appeared on the central monitor. He was a brilliant, highly analytical tactician who viewed corporate finance not as mathematics, but as a battlefield. While the medical staff quietly monitored my vitals from the periphery of the room, I reached into the pocket of my discarded coat and retrieved the crumpled piece of paper Dylan had so arrogantly tossed at me. I flattened the $24 million check against the glass surface of the scanning terminal, allowing the high-resolution optical readers to capture the exact routing sequences, account numbers, and Dylan's looping. Overconfident signature. The digitized image of the check materialized on the massive screen in front of Asher. I instructed him to bypass standard commercial banking channels and utilize our proprietary institutional clearing network to trace the absolute origin of the funds. I needed to know exactly which personal account Dylan had liquidated to purchase his freedom. For a man obsessed with his public image, parting with that level of liquid capital would undoubtedly leave a significant, traceable financial scar. The encrypted tracking software visualized the routing pathway in real time. A complex web of digital lines pulsed across the monitor, cutting through corporate firewalls and shell companies. Less than 3 minutes later, the routing trace locked onto a single, definitive origin point. Asher adjusted his glasses, his usually stoic expression fracturing into a look of genuine, profound disbelief. He looked directly into the camera, confirming the catastrophic reality of Dylan's transaction. The funds did not originate from Dylan's private wealth management portfolio. They were not drawn from his personal savings or even a leveraged line of credit against his personal equity. The account name clearly displayed on the monitor read, Series B Resort Expansion, Primary Operational Fund. A cold wave of realization washed over the command center, followed immediately by a sharp thrill of predatory satisfaction. Dylan had not merely written a large check to quietly make a domestic problem disappear. He had committed blatant, undeniable corporate fraud. He had dipped directly into the highly restricted venture capital money recently injected into his firm by his board of investors. That capital was legally earmarked exclusively for construction development and payroll. He had casually embezzled $24 million of investor money to use as hush money for his battered wife. He assumed I was exactly the naive, uneducated girl he had married. He calculated that a civilian depositing a check of that magnitude at a local credit union would trigger a mandatory federal hold taking up to 5 business days to clear. He believed he had an entire week to quietly shuffle assets and backfill the stolen operational capital before his corporate accountants ever noticed the massive discrepancy. He thought he was playing a brilliant game of financial chess. He never realized he was sitting across the board from a grandmaster. He just handed me the blade. The sterile fluorescent lighting of the command center hummed softly as I turned my attention back to the massive digital monitors. Asher, my lead financial tactician, stood completely still, waiting for my final authorization. The digitized image of the $24 million check glowed brightly on the screen, a monument to Dylan's catastrophic arrogance. I did not feel an ounce of hesitation. I placed my left hand flat against the biometric security pad mounted on the mahogany console. The system required a dual verification sequence for a capital transfer of this magnitude. I leaned forward, letting the retinal scanner capture my right eye. A soft electronic chime echoed through the room. The system flashed a brilliant green, confirming my absolute authority over the infrastructure. I looked directly at Asher and gave the order. I instructed him to force the immediate clearance of the funds. I explicitly commanded him not to route the transaction through any public commercial exchanges or standard retail banks. We were going to utilize the Thorne family's proprietary institutional clearinghouse. My grandfather had spent decades building a private financial infrastructure that essentially functioned as the central nervous system for the global banking sector. We did not wait for banks to process our money. The massive international banks relied on our protocols to function. Asher nodded sharply, his fingers flying across the glass keyboard. He initiated the override command without asking a single question. The high-definition wall monitor displayed a massive digital progress bar. I watched as the financial tracking software visualized the aggressive movement of the funds. It was a digital slaughter. $24 million vanished from the Chicago-based resort development firm and materialized instantly inside a heavily encrypted, untraceable Thorne holding account located in Geneva. There were no federal holds. There were no mandatory waiting periods. The operational balance of Dylan's most critical venture capital fund updated in real time, plummeting from a healthy 8-figure sum directly to absolute zero. Dylan had arrogantly assumed I was exactly the naive, uneducated girl he had married. He calculated that a civilian depositing a check of that magnitude at a local credit union would trigger a mandatory federal hold taking up to 5 business days to clear. He believed he had an entire week to quietly shuffle his liquid assets, secure a private bridge loan, and backfill the stolen operational capital before his corporate accountants ever noticed the massive discrepancy. He thought he was playing a brilliant game of financial chess, using investor capital as a temporary slush fund to make his battered wife disappear without a messy public scandal. He never realized he was sitting across the board from a grandmaster. He had casually embezzled highly restricted venture capital money, legally earmarked exclusively for construction development and payroll. Asher stepped back from the terminal, his voice tinged with genuine awe, as he confirmed the transaction was permanently locked. There was absolutely no reverse protocol available to them. He just handed me the blade. Across the city, the rich, heavy aroma of freshly ground espresso filled the warm air of the Chicago penthouse. While I was actively dismantling his empire from a subterranean bunker, Dylan was lounging in a plush silk robe, completely oblivious to the ticking clock. He stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, sipping his coffee, watching the city snowplows clear the aftermath of the brutal blizzard. He felt utterly invincible. In his mind, he had flawlessly executed a masterstroke of crisis management. He had excised a boring, useless wife and secured his future with the young, vibrant woman currently draped across his expensive Italian leather sofa. He believed his power was absolute. Sadie was aggressively scrolling through high-end real estate listings on her tablet. She did not spare a single thought for the violent expulsion that had taken place on that very floor just hours prior. She pouted her lips, adopting a high-pitched whining tone, and demanded that Dylan immediately wire a $2 million earnest money deposit for a luxury condo in the Gold Coast district. She insisted, batting her eyelashes, that she could not possibly live in a space without a custom climate-controlled dressing room. Dylan simply chuckled, walking over to kiss her cheek. He confidently promised her that the wire transfer would be handled by his accounting team before noon. He was in the middle of pouring himself a second cup of espresso when his smartphone violently vibrated against the marble kitchen island. It was not a standard notification chime. It was a harsh, blaring emergency alert tone, reserved exclusively for catastrophic banking failures. He frowned, setting the silver espresso carafe down, and picked up the device. A stark red banner flashed across the high-resolution display. It was an automated, high-priority message from his primary corporate lending institution. Then a second message arrived, and a third. His phone began vibrating uncontrollably, dancing across the palm of his hand like a dying insect as a relentless barrage of system warnings flooded his screen. Urgent alert. Series B, operational fund insufficient. Urgent alert. Automated payroll processing failed. Urgent alert. Catastrophic margin call initiated. All corporate assets frozen pending immediate federal review. Dylan stared at the glowing screen, his arrogant, confident smirk freezing into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen gray. The notifications continued to pile up, each one a deafening digital scream, signaling the absolute destruction of the empire he had built on a foundation of lies. He frantically tapped the screen, his hands shaking violently as he tried to refresh the banking application, desperately praying it was just a massive software glitch. The ceramic coffee mug slipped from his trembling fingers, shattering against the expensive hardwood floor. His perfect illusion was entirely dead. Panic is a highly destructive force when it infects an arrogant mind. Dylan practically tore his custom suit from his closet, abandoning a bewildered Sadie in the penthouse without a single word of explanation. He raced to his corporate headquarters, ignoring the treacherous icy roads, bypassing his executive assistants, and immediately summoning his older sister. Monica stormed into his expansive corner office, her pristine composure already fracturing. As the director of legal affairs, she had just received the same catastrophic automated banking alerts. When Dylan frantically confessed that he had written me a $24 million check from the restricted operational fund, assuming it would take days to clear, Monica completely lost her mind. She screamed at him, slamming her designer briefcase onto his polished mahogany desk, realizing he had just exposed them to massive federal indictments. Desperation breeds catastrophic mistakes. Rather than advising her brother to surrender and seek immediate legal counsel, Monica reverted to her usual strategy of ruthless intimidation. She firmly believed that because I had always been quiet and subservient, I could easily be bullied into submission. She opened her laptop, logged into her easily traceable corporate email account, and began typing with aggressive, furious force. She did not draft a standard legal demand. She drafted a weapon of pure, unadulterated blackmail, completely ignoring every fundamental ethical rule established by the American Bar Association. The email arrived in my secure inbox 10 minutes later. Monica explicitly demanded the immediate return of the $24 million. She threatened that if I refused or if I dared to report Dylan's physical abuse to the local authorities, she would personally ensure I faced malicious prosecution. She claimed she had deep connections with local judges in Chicago and would fabricate evidence of extortion to leave me bankrupt and begging on the freezing streets. She hit send entirely convinced that her aggressive legal jargon would terrify a penniless landscape designer into handing the money back. If you've ever watched a narcissist's arrogance crumble in real time, hit the like button and let me know in the comments. Monica had just willingly handed me a pristine, legally binding confession of extortion. She had explicitly outlined her intent to bribe state judges and weaponize the legal system to cover up a violent felony, all transmitted across state lines from a corporate server. She thought she was terrifying a vulnerable victim into silence. She had absolutely no idea she was handing a billionaire predator the exact weapon required to obliterate her entire legal career and guarantee her permanent disbarment. She signed her own federal indictment. Dylan and Monica could not comprehend the terrifying speed of their own destruction because they fundamentally misunderstood the absolute power of process by documentation. When dealing with the level of wealth my grandfather commanded, money does not exist as physical paper. It exists as a series of highly aggressive, automated legal triggers. The biometric key I carried did not just open a standard retail bank account. It granted me direct access to an irrevocable trust, a bulletproof legal entity designed explicitly to bypass local jurisdictions and completely neutralize standard commercial banking delays. Because my trust was directly integrated into a global institutional clearinghouse, it operated with immediate predatory efficiency. When I deposited his $24 million check through that secure network, the system did not ask for permission or wait for human verification. It forcibly extracted the exact capital from his operational accounts to settle the debt in milliseconds. More importantly, the system automatically logged the origin of those funds. By drawing directly from his venture capital pool, Dylan had triggered an irreversible chain reaction. The clearinghouse algorithms immediately recognized the unauthorized diversion of restricted investor capital and autonomously notified his primary lenders of the massive breach in fiduciary duty. This was the flawless beauty of a system built on ironclad documentation. There was no room for emotional manipulation, no space for Dylan's weaponized charm, and absolutely no opportunity for Monica to file a local injunction to freeze my assets. A verbal promise or a quiet settlement might have allowed them to survive another day, but the moment Dylan put his arrogant signature on a corporate check and handed it to me, he created an immutable paper trail. He legally documented his own massive corporate embezzlement. The law prioritizes undeniable documentation over narrative spin. Dylan and Monica had arrogantly assumed the role of apex predators, entirely blind to the fact that they were simply swimming in a much larger, much deeper ocean. They had confidently walked directly into a perfectly designed financial bear trap. They thought they could bully their way out of a felony, completely unaware that the financial infrastructure they relied on had already executed their death sentence. The automated protocols were ruthlessly efficient, stripping away their wealth and their freedom with cold algorithmic precision. The steel jaws snapped entirely shut. While Dylan and Monica were spiraling into a state of absolute panic, I remained perfectly still in the subterranean command center sipping a cup of dark espresso. The localized nerve blocks were holding the physical pain in my chest at bay, allowing my mind to operate with crystalline clarity. Destroying Dylan financially was only the first phase of my strategy. I needed to completely dismantle the toxic ecosystem he had built around himself. I instructed Asher to shift the forensic audit's focus away from Dylan's primary accounts and directly onto the internal expenditure logs surrounding Sadie's interior design department. Dylan had proudly paraded Sadie as his brilliant new creative director, justifying her exorbitant salary by claiming she brought unparalleled aesthetic value to his luxury resorts. I knew better. I had seen her amateurish mood boards and derivative concepts. I wanted to know exactly how much his blind infatuation was costing his investors. Asher ran a deep algorithmic sweep of the vendor invoices submitted by Sadie over the past 8 months. The results materialized on the massive digital monitor, and they were breathtakingly brazen. Sadie was not a naive, lovesick assistant simply caught in the crossfire. She was an incredibly efficient, calculating parasite. The audit revealed a complex network of offshore holding accounts registered in the Cayman Islands under a newly formed shell corporation. Sadie had been systematically inflating the costs of imported Italian marble, custom lighting fixtures, and bespoke furniture by over 300%. She had quietly funneled millions of dollars of Dylan's highly leveraged corporate capital directly into her own private accounts. She was actively bleeding him dry while sleeping in his bed and demanding $2 million condos. Dylan had destroyed his marriage, brutalized his wife, and committed federal wire fraud to protect a woman who was actively robbing him blind. He was aggressively defending a parasite that was quietly killing its host. The sheer irony of his situation was almost poetic. I instructed Asher to compile the offshore routing numbers, the inflated vendor invoices, and the Shell Corporation registration documents into a pristine, heavily encrypted red dossier. I was not going to simply hand this information to the authorities. I was going to use it to shatter their alliance from the inside out, letting Dylan see exactly who he had sacrificed his empire for. I prepared the final sharp blade. I turned my attention back to the threatening email Monica had so carelessly sent from her corporate account. She had given me exactly 48 hours to return the funds, explicitly promising to fabricate criminal charges against me if I failed to comply. She expected me to respond with a long, emotional defense, begging her to leave me alone. She expected tears, panic, and ultimately absolute submission. She had spent her entire legal career bullying vulnerable opponents into silent compliance, and she assumed I would be no different. I did not give her the satisfaction of an emotional reaction. I smoothly forwarded her entire email thread directly to my personal contact within the Federal Bureau of Investigation's White-Collar Crime Division in Chicago. I attached the encrypted routing logs proving Dylan's embezzlement alongside a formal request for an immediate digital forensic sweep of Monica's corporate servers. By officially involving the federal authorities, I bypassed Monica's corrupt local connections entirely. She could not intimidate a federal prosecutor, and she certainly could not bribe her way out of an airtight paper trail documenting extortion. Then I drafted a reply to Monica. I did not mention the FBI. I did not mention the massive federal investigation I had just initiated. I did not even mention the offshore accounts Sadie was currently utilizing to drain their remaining capital. I simply typed two perfectly calm, unbothered words. Meet me. I included the exact address of a high-end, glass-walled boardroom located in the absolute center of the Chicago financial district, setting the meeting for exactly 3 o'clock that afternoon. The location appeared neutral, but it was a premium commercial building entirely owned and operated by Thorn Global Real Estate. I was inviting them to step directly onto my chessboard. They thought they were meeting a terrified victim to finalize a surrender, completely unaware they were walking into their own execution. If you believe that staying calm is the ultimate weapon against toxic people, type "calm" in the comments below. I closed the heavy encrypted laptop and stood up, carefully adjusting the cuffs of my tailored charcoal suit. The bruised, discarded landscape designer they had thrown into the freezing blizzard no longer existed. I was walking into that boardroom as the absolute architect of their total destruction. The hunt was now officially on. The relentless Chicago blizzard had finally broken by the time the clock approached 3 in the afternoon, leaving the city buried under a thick, pristine layer of white snow. The towering glass facade of the commercial high-rise reflected the pale winter sunlight, projecting an imposing monolithic presence over the financial district. I sat quietly in the massive executive boardroom located on the 80th floor, my back turned entirely to the heavy mahogany doors. I was facing the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the frozen expanse of Lake Michigan. The room was breathtakingly expansive, dominated by a 50-foot conference table carved from a single, flawless slab of petrified wood. It was a space designed specifically to intimidate a physical manifestation of absolute corporate dominance. Down in the grand lobby, Dylan, Monica, and Sadie were arrogantly swiping their temporary visitor passes. The security feeds displayed on my hidden desktop monitor tracked their every movement. Dylan was wearing a bespoke navy suit, aggressively projecting the image of a successful billionaire, completely ignoring the fact that his corporate accounts were currently sitting at absolute zero. He genuinely believed that this meeting was a desperate surrender on my part. He assumed I had exhausted my meager resources, realized the sheer magnitude of his sister's legal threats, and was now ready to beg for a quiet settlement. Monica marched slightly ahead of him, clutching her expensive leather briefcase like a weapon of war. She was already mentally rehearsing the brutal non-disclosure agreements she planned to force down my throat. Sadie trailed behind them, constantly checking her reflection in the polished titanium walls of the elevator, utterly unbothered by the lives her lies had destroyed just hours earlier. They moved with the synchronized entitlement of people who believed they owned the world, completely oblivious to the fact that they were stepping directly into a perfectly orchestrated slaughterhouse. The heavy mahogany doors of the boardroom finally clicked open. The sound of their confident footsteps echoed across the thick acoustic carpet. Dylan did not wait for an invitation to speak. He immediately launched into a loud, incredibly condescending monologue, his voice booming through the cavernous space. He proudly announced that they were ready to accept my formal apology and finalize the paperwork for my immediate departure from his life. He demanded I stop wasting his highly valuable time and hand over the $24 million before he allowed his sister to completely ruin my future. He was speaking to the back of my high-backed leather chair, expecting a terrified, trembling woman to answer him. I did not say a single word. I simply let his arrogant echoes die out in the massive room, allowing the heavy, suffocating silence to stretch on for several agonizing seconds. The sheer lack of a response caused his confident posture to falter slightly. I reached forward, pressing a small silver button embedded in the surface of my desk. The heavy chair slowly rotated. The absolute silence that descended upon the boardroom was deafening. I sat perfectly poised, resting my hands lightly on the polished surface of the petrified wood table. I was not wearing the oversized faded sweaters or the sensible shoes Dylan was accustomed to seeing me in. I was dressed in a custom razor-sharp charcoal suit that fit me like tailored armor. My posture was flawless, my expression was entirely unreadable, and my dark eyes were completely devoid of the warmth he had exploited for 3 years. I did not look like a broken, discarded landscape designer. I looked exactly like what I was, the sole chief executive officer of a global financial empire. Monica was the first to react, her arrogant mind violently rejecting the visual confirmation in front of her. She let out a sharp, incredulous bark of laughter, stepping forward and planting her hands firmly on her hips. She sneered, asking how on earth I had managed to sneak past the building's building security detail, genuinely convinced this was some bizarre, elaborate prank. She threatened to call the police and have me arrested for criminal trespassing if I did not immediately vacate the executive floor. I did not flinch at her loud, shrill outburst. I simply raised a single manicured finger. The heavy oak doors at the back of the boardroom immediately swung open. 4 highly trained, elite private security contractors stepped into the room. They did not move toward me to remove me from the premises. Instead, they marched silently forward and took up strict defensive positions directly behind my high-backed leather chair, standing at absolute attention. The visual confirmation of undeniable institutional power was absolute. The blood drained instantly from Dylan's face. The arrogant, champagne-fueled confidence he had carried into the room completely evaporated, replaced by a cold, terrifying dread that visibly settled into the pit of his stomach. His expensive leather shoes caught slightly on the thick carpet as he instinctively stumbled backward. His perfectly constructed reality was disintegrating in real time. He looked around the massive boardroom, his eyes darting from the elite security personnel to the subtle embossed logo of Thorn Global Real Estate etched into the glass walls. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had not been summoned to neutral territory. He was standing in the absolute epicenter of my family's power. He opened his mouth to deploy his usual weaponized charm to somehow manipulate the dynamic back in his favor, but his vocal cords were entirely paralyzed. He was staring at the woman he had violently thrown into a blizzard just hours ago. Now realizing she possessed the capacity to crush his entire existence without even raising her voice. He was absolutely nothing now. Unlike her brother, Monica did not retreat into a state of paralyzed shock. She had spent her entire professional career aggressively crushing weaker opponents in corporate litigation, and her mind simply could not process that the quiet, unassuming woman she had threatened via email was actually a billionaire predator. Her pristine composure entirely shattered. Her face flushed a dark, furious red as she stepped forward. slamming her designer briefcase down onto the petrified wood table with a deafening crack that echoed violently off the glass walls. She began screaming, her voice shrill and echoing with absolute panic. She accused me of orchestrating a massive multi-year marital fraud. She claimed I had deliberately lied to Dylan about my identity, signing legal documents under false pretenses, while presenting myself as a financially dependent spouse. She aggressively pointed a trembling finger at my face, threatening to drag me through the federal courts, promising to have me prosecuted and entirely destroyed for this unprecedented level of deception. I remained perfectly still in my chair, projecting an aura of untouchable, chilling control. I reached for the crystal glass resting beside my documents and took a slow, deliberate sip of water, forcing her to wait for my response. When I finally spoke, my voice was dangerously soft, yet it carried perfectly across the vast room. I calmly corrected her, stating that I had never lied about a single thing. I had told Dylan I worked remotely, analyzing and designing properties, which was exactly what I did for Thorn Global's international portfolio. I leaned forward slightly, locking my dark eyes onto Monica. I explained that she and her brother operated like typical newly wealthy amateurs who fundamentally misunderstood how real power functioned. They believed that screaming loudly, wearing expensive designer labels, and dominating conversations made them legitimate. They assumed I was poor simply because I did not feel the need to constantly announce my worth. Real wealth, I whispered coldly, never needs to scream. I shifted my gaze back to Dylan, who was gripping the edge of the heavy table to stabilize his visibly trembling legs. I told him he had explicitly asked for a submissive, quiet wife who would stand in his shadow and make him feel like a visionary giant. I had simply given him exactly what he requested. I had stripped away my corporate titles and my family money to see if his affection was genuine or if he merely loved how my subservience amplified his massive ego. His decision to discard me into a freezing storm had provided my final answer. I pushed the red folder. The heavy crimson cardboard of the dossier stood out violently against the dark, polished surface of the petrified wood table. It slid silently across the immense distance, coming to a halt exactly 1 inch from Dylan's trembling fingertips. In the corporate acquisition world, a red file signifies a hostile takeover, a formal declaration of absolute financial war. Dylan stared at the folder with wide, terrified eyes, completely paralyzed by the implications of what it contained. I did not raise my voice as I instructed him to open it. I calmly informed him that I had not invited him to my headquarters to discuss a marital settlement, nor was I interested in returning the $24 million he had so graciously provided. I had invited him here to officially inform him that his company was dead. With violently shaking hands, Dylan slowly flipped open the heavy cover of the dossier. The very first page displayed the highly encrypted routing trace from our institutional clearinghouse, providing irrefutable documented proof that he had embezzled highly restricted investor capital to pay off his battered wife. But that was only the beginning of his nightmare. I instructed him to turn to the second section of the file. As he flipped the thick pages, the color completely vanished from Sadie's face. The documents detailed the complex network of offshore holding accounts registered in the Cayman Islands under a newly formed shell corporation. I watched Dylan's eyes scan the aggressively inflated vendor invoices, the fraudulent billing statements for Italian marble and custom lighting fixtures, and the direct wire transfers linking Sadie's interior design department to the hidden offshore accounts. The realization struck Dylan with devastating force. He slowly turned his head to look at the young, vibrant woman he had destroyed his marriage for. Sadie immediately began backing away toward the glass doors, stammering out pathetic, fragmented excuses, claiming the documents were fabricated, that I was just trying to frame her out of pure jealousy. But Dylan was not a complete fool when it came to reading financial ledgers. He recognized the account signatures. He recognized the exact dates of the massive capital drains. He realized in a moment of sheer, unadulterated humiliation that he had committed federal wire fraud and permanently bankrupted his entire resort empire to protect a calculating thief. Sadie had been systematically bleeding him dry while smiling in his face and demanding million-dollar condos. The fragile alliance between the three of them shattered instantly. Dylan lunged forward, screaming at Sadie, grabbing her arm while she shrieked and desperately tried to claw his hands away. Monica yelled at both of them to shut up, realizing they were self-destructing in a room clearly wired with security cameras. They tore each other apart. The chaotic screaming match echoing through the pristine boardroom abruptly ceased when Monica violently slammed her hand against the table. She recognized that her brother's empire was financially obliterated, and his personal life was a smoking crater, but she was not willing to let her own prestigious legal career sink with his ship. Driven by pure, desperate self-preservation, she resorted to her ultimate, highly illegal contingency plan. Monica let out a harsh, arrogant laugh, pulling her sleek smartphone from her pocket. She looked directly at me, her eyes burning with malicious triumph. She confidently announced that my little financial ambush was ultimately useless. She tapped the screen of her device, and a highly convincing audio recording began playing through the phone's speaker. It was a digital rendering of my voice, perfectly mimicking my cadence. Explicitly threatening to destroy Dylan's company unless he paid me $50 million in extortion money. It was a flawless deepfake manufactured by her crisis management team to completely rewrite the narrative of our conflict. She smirked, waving the phone in the air, proudly declaring that she had just transmitted the audio file to every major news outlet and financial publication in Chicago. She believed she had successfully executed a brilliant false counterattack. She assumed that by framing me as a vindictive extortionist, she would instantly paralyze Thorn Global's stock price and force me to drop the embezzlement charges to save my own family's public reputation. She stood tall, demanding I sign a full legal release, immediately entirely convinced she had just won the war. I did not show a single ounce of panic. I did not attempt to grab the phone or scream about the fabrication. I had spent my entire life anticipating the desperate, dirty tactics of cornered corporate predators. I simply offered her a cold, empty smile and pressed a second button on my console. The heavy mahogany doors swung open once more. 3 stern-faced federal agents from the FBI's white-collar crime division stepped into the room, their badges flashing under the recessed lighting. The lead agent walked directly toward Monica, completely ignoring her sudden, terrified silence. He did not ask questions. He simply dropped a thick, officially sealed document onto the table in front of her. It was a preliminary digital forensics report, issued by the Federal Cybercrimes Unit, irrefutably proving the audio file was a manufactured deepfake. I calmly informed Monica that I had forwarded her threatening email to the FBI exactly 3 hours ago. By transmitting a fabricated extortion tape across state lines to the media, she had just officially elevated her crimes from a local dispute to a massive federal felony. The lead agent stepped forward, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt, and began reading Monica her Miranda rights. The arrogant smile completely vanished from her face, replaced by the hollow stare of total destruction. Her legal career was over. The federal agents moved with a quiet, terrifying efficiency. They did not raise their voices, nor did they use unnecessary physical force. They simply secured the heavy steel handcuffs around Dylan's wrists, his bespoke navy suit wrinkling awkwardly under their firm grip. He looked completely hollowed out, a man who had spent his entire adult life building a towering monument to his own ego, only to watch it completely collapse into dust within a single afternoon. Before they led Dylan out of the boardroom, he turned back to look at me one last time. His eyes were wide, silently pleading for a mercy he had never once extended to me. He expected me to gloat, to throw his cruel words back in his face. I simply offered him a brief, dismissive nod, turning my back on him before he even crossed the threshold. That silent rejection was the final blow to his fragile pride. He realized I did not hate him. I simply did not care about his existence anymore. Monica was escorted right behind him, her head bowed in absolute crushing defeat. The brilliant legal mind who had built a lucrative career on intimidation and corporate blackmail was now actively hiding her face from the flashing cameras waiting just beyond the glass doors. She had attempted to weaponize the media against me, but now the press corps she had personally summoned to witness my destruction was eagerly documenting her humiliating downfall. Sadie, seizing what she believed was a brief moment of distraction, tried to slip out through the secondary service exit. She pulled her designer trench coat tightly around her shoulders, moving with the desperate, frantic energy of a cornered animal. She did not make it past the elevator bank. 2 financial investigators stepped smoothly into her path, blocking her only escape route. They coldly informed her that her passport had been flagged, and all offshore accounts tied to her fraudulent shell corporation in the Cayman Islands were officially seized by federal authorities. She began weeping real tears this time as the investigators calmly placed her under arrest for corporate embezzlement and international wire fraud. I stood near the panoramic windows watching the chaotic procession exit the building. The flashing strobe lights of the paparazzi cameras illuminated the street below, casting harsh, fragmented shadows against the pristine white snow. The public execution was absolute. The industry titans and venture capitalists who had once eagerly funded Dylan's resort empire were now furiously dialing their legal teams, frantically trying to distance their names from the massive, unfolding scandal. I did not feel a sudden rush of euphoric joy. There was no theatrical celebration, no dramatic sigh of relief. The satisfaction I felt was deep, quiet, and profoundly anchoring. I had methodically dismantled a toxic ecosystem that preyed on the defenseless, using nothing but the cold, undeniable truth of their own greed. I watched the police vehicles pull away their sirens, wailing into the freezing Chicago afternoon. The storm that had raged both inside and outside my life was finally over. I finally exhaled in peace. 6 months later, the bitter chill of the Chicago winter had completely melted away, replaced by the warm, golden light of early summer. I stood on the expansive terrace of the newly constructed Thorn Global Philanthropic Headquarters, feeling the gentle morning breeze against my face. The heavy, suffocating weight I had carried during my marriage to Dylan was entirely gone. I was no longer hiding behind faded sweaters or pretending to be a submissive accessory in someone else's manufactured narrative. I was standing firmly in my own undeniable power. Looking down from the terrace, I observed the bustling construction site spanning an entire city block. It was not another exclusive luxury resort designed to inflate a billionaire's ego. It was the physical manifestation of the $24 million I had surgically extracted from Dylan's ruined empire. I had poured every single cent of that recovered capital into establishing the Shelter of Hope Foundation. The transition was not without its administrative hurdles. Securing the federal clearances to permanently repurpose seized embezzled funds required months of meticulous legal navigation, but the federal prosecutors, thoroughly disgusted by the sheer audacity of Dylan and Monica's crimes, moved with unprecedented cooperation. The $24 million was legally reclassified as a punitive restitution grant awarded directly to my newly formed charitable trust. It was the perfect, legitimate closure to a highly complex financial war. The project was a comprehensive, state-of-the-art sanctuary designed specifically for women escaping financial and physical abuse. We were not merely building temporary housing. The blueprints I had personally drafted included a dedicated legal clinic, robust psychological counseling centers, and extensive vocational training workshops. The very wealth Dylan had attempted to use to silence and discard me was now actively funding a legal army to protect the vulnerable. I walked back into my sunlit executive office, running my hand along the edge of my drafting table. I was finally using my architectural skills for a purpose that resonated with my soul. The foundation was rapidly expanding, partnering with corporate allies who valued genuine societal impact over shallow public relations stunts. We were actively dismantling the exact systems of control Dylan had relied upon. The media narrative had also completely shifted. The financial sector initially viewed my hostile takeover as a ruthless, cold-blooded execution. But as the Shelter of Hope began opening its doors, the public perception rapidly evolved. They saw the undeniable, tangible good emerging from the ashes of a spectacular corporate collapse. I was recognized as a highly strategic architect of justice. I had taken the darkest, most humiliating night of my life and transformed it into a beacon of permanent safety for hundreds of others. The foundation was thriving beautifully. The quiet hum of the office was pleasantly interrupted by the soft clinking of porcelain. Mrs. Higgins stepped onto the terrace, carrying a silver tray with 2 steaming cups of Earl Grey tea. She was no longer wearing the muted, modest uniform of a domestic servant. She was dressed in an elegant, tailored navy blazer, looking vibrant, healthy, and deeply respected. She was now the honorary advisory director of the Shelter of Hope, ensuring that our outreach programs always maintained a foundation of genuine human empathy. Mrs. Higgins had taken her advisory role with incredible dedication. She spent her afternoons speaking with the women arriving at our temporary shelters, offering them the same unwavering, comforting presence she had given me during my worst fevers. She handed me a teacup, her warm, familiar smile radiating absolute peace. She did not have to worry about a stolen pension or a freezing winter night ever again. Her future was completely secure, protected by an ironclad trust fund I had personally established in her name. Seeing her thrive, completely unburdened by the fear Dylan had tried to instill in her, was my greatest personal victory. We stood side by side in companionable silence, watching the construction crews pour the final concrete foundations for the new legal clinic. My morning schedule included one final, highly sensitive appointment. I walked back to my desk as the heavy oak doors opened, admitting Warren Dylan's younger brother. Warren was the exact opposite of Dylan: quiet, incredibly intelligent, and completely devoid of the toxic arrogance that infected the rest of his family. During the darkest days of my marriage, Warren was the only person who had gently warned me about Dylan's destructive narcissistic patterns. He had lacked the power to intervene back then, but he had possessed the rare courage to speak the truth. Dylan's spectacular downfall had left their family's remaining legitimate assets in complete disarray. Warren had stepped up to manage the heavy fallout, desperately trying to salvage the livelihood of the innocent employees caught in the crossfire of his brother's massive fraud. I respected his accountability. I gestured for him to sit across from my desk, pushing a thick, professionally bound portfolio toward him. It was a formal partnership agreement. I was offering to inject clean, highly monitored capital into his new ethical development firm, strictly conditional on his absolute transparency and adherence to my operational protocols. Warren reviewed the terms, his hands visibly trembling as he processed the generous yet strictly regulated lifeline. He understood that this was not charity. It was a highly calculated investment in a man who had proven his moral integrity. He looked up, expressing a profound, genuine gratitude that his brother had never been capable of mustering. We shook hands, finalizing an alliance built on mutual respect rather than manipulation. I had severed the diseased branches of his family tree, but I chose to nurture the one healthy root that remained. We built a new legacy. Looking back at the cold marble floor of that Chicago penthouse, the memory feels like it belongs to an entirely different lifetime. The woman who lay there bruised and quietly enduring the ultimate betrayal had to face total destruction to realize her own undeniable strength. When you are trapped in the cycle of learned helplessness, the absolute hardest step is simply acknowledging the reality of your invisible chains. I spent 3 years justifying cruel behavior because I wanted the warm illusion of a happy home. I accepted the bare minimum, mistaking tiny breadcrumbs of superficial affection for genuine love. It is a terrifying reality to face. But sometimes the people who claim to love you are actively keeping you small, feeding on your deep insecurities to inflate their own fragile egos. They want you to believe that without them, you are entirely worthless. They use financial control, emotional manipulation, and sometimes physical intimidation to build an invisible cage around your true potential. They think that pushing you out into the freezing cold will force you to break, that the harsh realities of the world will inevitably send you crawling back to their toxic shelter. It took a night of brutal violence and the cruel dismissal of an innocent elderly woman to finally wake me up. But once that profound clarity hits you, it becomes an unstoppable, undeniable force. You stop seeking validation from those who are absolutely committed to misunderstanding you. You redirect that energy inward, using it to forge boundaries of absolute steel. I learned that setting firm boundaries is not an act of malice. It is the most profound act of self-preservation. They fundamentally misunderstand the nature of resilience. They do not realize that the isolation they impose on you becomes the quiet space where you finally remember your own inherent value. You realize that a true family is never defined simply by bloodlines or marriage certificates. It is defined by mutual respect, shared decency, and unconditional protection. My grandfather left me a massive financial empire, but the true legacy I inherited was the courage to weaponize my own worth. You do not have to possess a billionaire's trust fund to reclaim your life. Your most powerful, irrevocable asset is your absolute refusal to let anyone else dictate your value. The process of walking away is agonizing, and the road to rebuilding is incredibly daunting. But the peace you secure on the other side is completely priceless. You cannot heal in the exact same environment that broke you. You must have the bravery to endure the temporary storm to reach the enduring sunlight. I chose to completely dismantle the shadows so I could finally build in the light. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic people to protect your own peace? Share your story in the comments below and remember to hit that subscribe button. because the best revenge is never about holding on to the anger. It is about completely outgrowing the people who desperately tried to keep you small. I am completely free now.